And rolling. Yep.
Take one. Take two.
Hey guys, Blake Calhoun. How are you? I am still working at home, recording this podcast during the global pandemic of 2020. Not sure when this is going to end. I hope it ends soon, but we're making the best of it. And so I hope everyone is doing well. The best way for me to deal with this is to stay creative and to stay active. And so I've been making quite a few YouTube videos and trying to stay busy, homeschooling the kids. I entered the Film Riot Short Film Challenge contest and I did a film called Homeschool. If you haven't seen that, check it out on my YouTube channel. Didn't win, but that's not really the point. Had a good time making it. And I talk a lot about gear in all my videos, but the whole point to the gear is to make stuff. And so that segues me to the topic of today's podcast, and that is using your iPhone to make a short film. And last fall, Filmic Pro did their annual short film contest, which I entered that too, by the way, and didn't win. But hey, I did win back in 2018. I don't know. It's not about the winning, of course, but I always have a good time making these short films. But I digress. I saw a short called No Hard Feelings, and as soon as I saw it, I was like, what? That was shot on an iPhone? I do a lot of smartphone video, as you know, if you follow my YouTube channel and this podcast, and I had really never seen anything shot like that. And so it instantly intrigued me. If you haven't seen the short film and don't know what I'm talking about, they used a B-script DOF adapter, depth of field adapter. And so it has very shallow depth of field, which is fine, which is cool. But on top of that, just the aesthetic, it looks like nothing I've really seen. I would say it's the closest thing to a film look I've come across since I've really been focusing on mobile filmmaking for the last several years. Well, I started my YouTube channel in 2012, but it was very part-time for about 5 years. Last couple years, I've focused on it pretty consistently. And so in saying all that, I contacted the filmmakers. They are a group of guys out of Melbourne, Australia, and I connected with the cinematographer, the DP, a guy named Dave Cleeve. And he generously agreed to do an interview with me. Now, this was not a back and forth interview because I wanted to have supporting video. So I sent him the questions and he sent me back interview clips. And as a matter of fact, I created a video version of this podcast for my YouTube channel. Be sure to check that out after this podcast if you hadn't seen it already. If you're coming from YouTube to listen to this, the main difference between these two interviews, besides you can't see anything with a podcast, duh, I included all the content from the interview here on this podcast. I just felt like it would be too long on YouTube. As it is, the YouTube video is almost 20 minutes long, and for my channel, that's a long video. But podcasts, hey, we make them whatever length we want. Some of mine are 10 minutes, some of mine are an hour. But I really love what these guys did. Not only the look of the film, but the film itself is very funny, very well done. I really enjoyed it. It is not safe for work. I wouldn't say it's rated R necessarily. It's all done in good fun, but it does have to do with an adult situation. If you've seen the movie, you know what I mean. And a clip I will play will give you an idea of what it's all about. But I also just love the approach they took. Taking a small crew to Indonesia. They're from Australia, so I think that's a pretty common place for people to vacation. Grabbing their iPhone, they took the B-script DOF adapter, and they just went out and went for it. And it sounded like a lot of the shoot was improvised too. The story felt like it was pretty well scripted, but the way they shot it felt a little bit by the hip. Which again, indie filmmaking, I think that's pretty cool. I really like that approach. Before I get into the interview with Dave, just a reminder that if you want to learn more about smartphone video or smartphone cinematography, I do have several courses: The Complete Guide to Filmic Pro, Smartphone Cinematography 101, and a LumaFusion color grading course. All these are available on my website at ifilmmakers.tv. All right, so now we'll get into the interview with Dave, and keep in mind, again, this was not a back and forth conversation. I asked him questions via email and he sent me answers. And so the first thing I wanted to know about him was a little bit about his filmmaking background.
So I'm based in Melbourne, Australia. I've shot sort of all around Australia, and I've been internationally as well to shoot things here and there. So a little bit about my background. When I got out of high school, I went to university and did a course there in film and television. And then after that, I got a job working in a production company for 2 years and really learned to sort of cut my teeth on shooting, editing, producing, being a one-man band. And so after working there, I started going freelance, and that's when I started to take cinematography a bit more seriously. So after a couple of years of going freelance, I ended up actually buying into a franchise for a production company. And this was based out of Queensland in Australia, but they had franchises all over the world: New York, Miami, London, New Zealand. So they were all over the place. And I had one in Melbourne, Australia. So I ran that for about 4.5 years. And in mid-2017 was when I left that franchise behind and started focusing again on my freelancing cinematography. So I'd say, probably since mid-2017 is when I've really started to try and step up my variety of work and the level of my cinematography, and just trying to tackle as many different things as I can.
I wasn't exactly sure what kind of cinematography he focused on. A lot of people do commercials, some people do features, and then again, a lot of people mix and match.
So I don't normally shoot just narrative film. I've definitely done a little bit of that here and there, but I've done sort of a bit of everything. So I've shot music videos, web series, TVCs, short films, documentaries, and I do a lot of branded sort of online corporate content as well for paid work.
So in a lot of ways, that sounds like what I do. I make my living as a traditional filmmaker, but then I also do a lot of mobile filmmaking for YouTube, and just because I like it. And in that regard, I also own a lot of different cameras and use a lot of different cameras. And so when I meet people using mobile filmmaking tools, I also wonder about that with them.
So my day-to-day cameras are the Sony FS5 Mark II and the Blackmagic Pocket 4K. But I've shot projects with anything from a tiny little DSLR all the way up through Reds and RELXs and that kind of gear as well. So I've been pretty fortunate to shoot with a wide variety of cameras.
And it turns out this project was his first time using an iPhone in a more professional film environment. And speaking of the film, we'll segue into that now. What is No Hard Feelings about?
So the short, the logline for it is: Rodney's crumbling ego is at breaking point, and if his best pal Slim can't whip him into shape before his big date tonight, he might just lose it.
And here is an audio clip from the short film that I think will give you a good idea of what's going on here.
She wants to come over tonight.
That's fresh.
Fresh? That is not fresh. I can't handle the humiliation anymore. I used to be like a rock. Give me one whiff and I would be pitching a tent. Now?
Well, Rodney, we're not 20 anymore. It's going to drop off eventually.
Has yours dropped off?
Yeah.
Really?
Not really. No, actually, it's kind of increased a little bit, if anything, recently.
So there you go. It's a short film about a guy who is having trouble in the bedroom. Let's just put it nicely. And so I asked Dave why they shot this on an iPhone.
So for No Hard Feelings, the decision to shoot on the iPhone actually wasn't mine. I came on board pretty late in the project, and I'm really good friends with James and Paul, the two writers and directors and stars as well. And they asked me, if I was free, if I'd like to come over and shoot something, and they were planning to shoot it on iPhone. So I thought, it sounds like a fun little ride, and I'd never shot anything professionally on the iPhone either. So I thought it would be just an exciting challenge to undertake.
And that led me to wonder which devices they used for the shoot.
So we shot it on a iPhone XS Max and also the iPhone XS. They just sort of were interchangeable on set and what we had available. And we used the FILMMAKING Pro app to capture everything.
So they shot with an iPhone XS and a XS Max. At least that's how we say it in the States. Maybe they say it differently in Australia. But the main thing they used to make this work, besides the FILMMAKING Pro app, were the accessories, and in particular, the B-Script.
So we paired the phones with the B-Script Mark II adapter, and that was actually really handy in allowing us more control over our image and actually being able to house the phone a bit more safely and being able to attach it to things like tripods or even attach it to gimbals and that sort of thing. It was really beneficial using the B-Script Mark II. I don't think we would have been able to do what we did without it.
And being that they shot away from their home in an international location, they decided to keep everything accessory-wise to a minimum.
We shot the film on location in Canggu in Bali, And as a result of traveling internationally, we were trying to take as little gear with us as possible. So we didn't take anything like tripods or lights of our own. So we just had to rely on what we could source there. So the tripod that we had for the first couple of days was just an old photography tripod, and it definitely wasn't ideal. But then after a couple of days, we went to a rental house and managed to get a better tripod with fluid head and that sort of thing, which actually was a lot better for us to use. And also at that rental house, we were able to get a few Dito lights and some C-stands and some bounce boards and that sort of thing, so that we could light some of the more glamour shots that take place during the night scene on his date.
And beyond the few accessories they sourced locally, they obviously brought the main app with them, the Filmic Pro app. And so even though they were shooting a movie, I was curious what settings they used, where they shot 24p and that kind of thing.
So we shot everything in Filmic Pro at 24 frames, and we used the log profile. We decided this because we knew that the iPhone's dynamic range was already going to be pretty average. And so using that log profile at least allowed us to get just a little bit more room in the image so that we could grade it to the way that we wanted.
And that's a good way to go. Log V2 does grade pretty nicely, especially if it's shot low noise. And even if you get noise in the image, you can denoise it. And since Dave was the cinematographer, I asked him if he was involved with the color grading.
So James, who is one of the directors and the writers and actors of the film, also did the editing and the coloring. And I believe he just used one of the Film Convert plugins for Premiere Pro. And I don't think too much was done to the image apart from give it a bit of film grain, just to make it feel a bit more tangible and a little less iPhone-like. And I think the results were pretty amazing, actually. When I look at it myself, I struggle to feel like that's an iPhone's image. And so I think it's pretty incredible what we were able to pull out of that whole system.
And I totally agree. I was really, and I still am, impressed with the way this movie turned out looking. It also sounds like they kept it pretty simple in post-production, which is kind of interesting. I would probably use DaVinci Resolve, or maybe even do too much, I don't know, overproduce it. But I thought what they had looked very natural and very, very cinematic. And to that point, a lot of it was just achieved in camera. And that was by using the DOF adapter and professional lenses.
So the two lenses that we used on this film were the Sigma Art 24-70 2.8 and the Canon 70-200 2.8 Mark II. We used those in conjunction with the B-Script Mark II adapter, and it just gave us a really good focal range of shots that we could get. And when you pair that with something like the iPhone, it automatically just makes it feel like it's not an iPhone. I mean, being able to frame up zoom shots and get telephoto length shots and wide shots and that kind of thing was pretty amazing.
And so when I heard Dave say they used electronic lenses, I immediately thought, oh, how did they do that? If you've ever used the B-Script DOF adapter or the one from Ulanzi, you know they don't work with electronic glass. Everything that I've shot with those, I've used manual lenses. But they came up with a pretty unique way to make that work.
When we were using the electronic lenses, the Sigma and the Canon, the way we got around adjusting the aperture was basically we had a 5D camera on set, and anytime if we needed to adjust the aperture, we would just take the lens off the B-Script, we'd put it onto the 5D, dial in the aperture that we want, take it off, put it back onto the B-Script, and then our aperture is locked. So we weren't ever in a situation where we were having to adjust the aperture a lot. A lot of the times it was usually just once or twice at a certain location. So yeah, that didn't end up being too big of a deal for us. And having the 5D there allowed us to do pretty quick interchanges of lenses and dial in apertures when we needed to.
And just to be clear, so you understand what he's talking about, whenever you use lenses like that, you're adjusting the aperture in the camera. And so it's electronic. You don't actually adjust the aperture on the lens. And so older manual lenses or any cinema lenses have completely manual control. And that's actually what B-Script recommends using. That's all I've ever used. But it's interesting that they did it like this and it worked out great for them. But they did use a couple manual lenses as well.
We also had a couple of old manual Nikon lenses too, which were, we didn't use that often, but I think the main setup that we used that for was when we mounted the gimbal with the iPhone. And so we had a follow focus also attached to the manual lens, and that just gave us a bit more control over being on the gimbal and still trying to, rack focus during a shot and that kind of thing. So I can't quite remember whether it was a 35mm or a 50mm that we alternated between. I think we had both. but they were obviously a lot more lightweight than what the Sigma or the Canon lenses were. So we mainly just used that on the gimbal setup on the motorbike. So that was really the only time we used those manual lenses.
Using the B-Script DOF rig can give you a really amazing look. Again, this film looks awesome, but, and I've used it some, it can be pretty challenging to work with at times.
So utilizing the B-Script with those lenses and the iPhone, I'd say probably the challenges we faced were balancing of the rig. So obviously if you've got a 7200, it's quite long and heavy on the end of it. It just really gets a bit of dip going on. So getting your framing right and adjusting for that lean is quite difficult at times. And then we were just doing our best to frame up a shot, lock focus, and not have to worry about doing any focus pulls or anything like that, because as soon as you would start to turn the focus wheel, you'd get a bit of shake and you'd get a little bit of wobble going on in the lens, and it just wasn't a great situation for trying to pull focus.
I can attest that putting lenses on the B-Script does make it kind of wobbly. I actually have a rail system they sent me, which I haven't used yet, but I will definitely implement that when I use it in the future, especially with any bigger pieces of glass. And one thing, if you've seen this movie, and I do recommend, again, watching my YouTube video based around this interview, you'll notice that the aspect ratio of the film is pretty unique. At first I thought it was 4:3, but it's not. And then I thought maybe it's 1.66, like Super 16, and it's not that either.
So the final output of our film is somewhat in between 16:9 and 4:3. So we found that when shooting in conjunction with the B-Script adapter, we never quite got a clean full 16:9 image out of it, because the edges of the B-Script adapter, the mounts right on the lens, always sort of had a little bit of a border to it. And we thought, well, we can try and figure some way around this, but the directors actually liked the aesthetic of that. They didn't want it to be 16:9, they didn't want it to be 4:3 either. They liked that sort of middle ground, and it just gave it a bit of a different look, because every time we would put the phone back in and realign it, or if we'd change over from the XS to the XS Max, we'd have to adjust the alignments, get the lens right in the spot again for the B-Script. So we ended up having footage that had different sort of levels of where that border sat in the footage. So when James was editing, he had to make his own version of that border so that he could just make it consistent throughout the edit. So that was somewhat forced upon us based on how the B-Script interacted with the phone. We're not sure if it's because we were always shooting on the widest focal length of the phone's lens. We did try at times going to the 2x telephoto lens within the iPhone. But whenever we did that, we found that it just seemed like the full focus plane was always blurry and we could never get sharps on it. So I'm not sure why that was. We sort of discovered that as we were shooting, that we couldn't go to the 2x and get focus. So we just thought, you know what, we're just going to stick with the wide focal length. We'll deal with that border. It somewhat matches the aesthetic and the vibe of that 80s grungy kind of feel that we wanted anyway. So it ended up working out for the best.
Two things I wanted to note here. One thing that I've done using the B-Script is you can get the edges. It's like a vignette. But if you're shooting 4K, which they did, you can always slightly push in post-production, maybe 5% or 10%, and you'll have the clean edges. And so what I tend to do is frame things wider. And that way you know you're going to push in post-production. Because even the vignetting, you will sometimes get soft edges depending on the lens you're using. And the other thing is they use the B-Script Pro. When I've been shooting with a DOF adapter, I've been using the Beast Cage. And the Beast Cage really fits better and you get pretty much perfect alignment every time. And so I do recommend, if you're going to use the DOF adapter, to go with the Beast Cage. And they have a new Beast Cage coming out for the iPhone 11 soon. At the time of this recording, it hadn't been released yet, but they do have them for pretty much every other previous iPhone. And while I think there are a lot of advantages to shooting on an iPhone, there are disadvantages too. You can't have one without the other.
So disadvantages and advantages to shooting on an iPhone. Boy, what a question. I mean, firstly, I think advantage-wise, being able to have such a minimal kit and rig that you can just sort of place anywhere is pretty amazing. I mean, even when it is paired with the B-Script and a lens on the front, it's still quite compact and small. So it allows you to really get into places or be sneaky with your camera and that sort of thing. There were probably a few locations that we went to that if you rocked up in Canggu with, a big camera kit and that sort of thing, you'd draw a few eyeballs and a few sort of attention you might not want. But putting it through on the iPhone and just going in there, being able to get a quick shot, quick setup, you don't look like you're, coming with all this kit. That's pretty beneficial, I think. So that was really handy for a few of the setups that we had, because we were just running around Canggu doing the best that we could to find locations and do everything sort of on the spot. So I think it was really handy for that. I think the other advantage is probably the fact that the iPhone is its own storage device. So not having to cycle through cards and keep track of that all day, and, getting back to your computer at the end of the day and having to dump multiple different cards and all that sort of stuff. It's really easy just plugging in the phone, copy your files across, boom, you're done.
I found that to be really interesting. I'd never thought about that, but it is a good point. You have everything in one device. It can make it easier to keep track of stuff. If you've ever lost a card or dropped a card, those things are so small, then you know what I'm talking about. But sometimes, depending on what you're doing, the disadvantages can be pretty tricky.
So I'd probably say the disadvantages actually somewhat outweighed the advantages at times. Then again, this was my first time using the Filmic Pro app, shooting professionally on an iPhone, doing all the things that we needed to consider for that. So now, having gone through it and knowing what needs to be done and the pitfalls that you might face along the way, the next time I would do it, it would be quite a lot simpler, and I would know what to look for. I know things to keep an eye out for. So I don't think it would be as big of a deal next time. On location shooting, we had a few issues with the phone and the app overheating and crashing at times. Now, shooting in Bali and Canggu, the humidity is just off the charts and it's very, very hot there. So I'm sure that wasn't a great environment for the phone to try and thrive and work efficiently in. So on the XS Max and the XS iPhones, we did encounter overheating and crashing every now and then. It wasn't too significant. We only probably lost maybe 3 or 4 clips throughout the 1 week of shooting time. But it certainly was still a little bit frustrating to deal with. But again, I haven't tested using that setup in an environment that's not quite as humid and hot. So it may not have been such a problem in another location, but certainly in Indonesia, it was a bit of a struggle.
Heat problems are one of the bigger issues I've had in the past as well. Shooting in Texas in the summer, you really just can't be outside. The phone would overheat. However, I will say now that the iPhone 11 Pro Max that I have, really no overheating issues at all. That phone runs very, very smoothly. Now, I haven't really done a lot of outside shooting in the heat, but thus far, it has been rock solid. But beyond the heat issues, they also had some challenges setting the exposure.
So probably one of the more frustrating features of shooting on the phone, I don't know if it's specific to the app that we use, but I imagine that iPhone is pretty tricky no matter what. But getting exposure right was really tough, because we found that shooting anything over ISO 100 on the iPhone started to get really grainy and noisy. And then to match the ISO level with the right shutter speed was pretty tricky, because we discovered that you couldn't independently adjust the shutter speed and the ISO from one another.
So I had to interrupt the interview here to say that you can actually adjust the ISO and shutter independently. Again, I wasn't doing a back and forth interview with Dave, and so after I got this clip from him, I responded and explained to him that you can in fact do that, and I gave a brief description on how to do it, and so he then responded with a new interview clip.
So actually, in my discussions on email back and forth with you, Blake, you actually brought to my attention the fact that the shutter speed and the ISO can be locked and adjusted independently. When we were shooting this back in September of 2019, we didn't have a lot of time to really get to play with the app before we started shooting. We did a few tests and we tried to learn it as well as we could. But for the life of us, we were just unable to figure out how to independently adjust the shutter and the ISO from one another. And we did discover that shooting anything over 100 ISO wasn't super ideal. It got quite noisy and it wasn't super clean. So we're always trying to keep it under that. And because we couldn't figure out a way to independently separate them, we found the frustrating part of trying to push on the screen to get a rough auto exposure within the app, and then just hit and hope that it would give us the shutter value of 1/48 that we were after, as well as an ISO range below 100. And so now, looking back on it, realizing that I could have just swiveled that line on the app to get to 1/48 and then tap it and lock it and then adjust the ISO independently is pretty annoying to find out, because we spent a lot of time mucking about with trying to get those exposures right on set. And I feel like that would have actually saved us a lot of time. So, oh well, lesson to be learned, and I can take that forth next time if I do it again.
Of course, in the end, the movie looks great, so it all worked out fine for them, but it would have saved them a lot of time. Although sometimes I will say that I do auto-expose on the brightest object on the screen using the exposure reticle just to see what it does. But then when you go into manual and you see the arc sliders, I will typically lock the shutter at 148 and then see what the ISO does. Or if you're using an ND filter like a variable ND filter, you could just lock the shutter and the ISO and adjust your exposure using the ND. Every situation is different. But again, in the end, their movie looked great, but do know that you can independently adjust the ISO and the shutter. One other interesting thing they ran into is they actually recorded the video only. They recorded no audio in the app.
So one of the things we discovered in our trial and error before filming was that using this app, shooting at all the highest possible settings that we could within the app, the best way to get it not to glitch as much was to actually have to turn the audio off. So none of the clips that we shot actually had onboard audio. So that became a real tough nightmare for syncing in post, because we had to do everything with our own manual clap marks, because we didn't have any ACs, we didn't have anyone with clappers and that kind of thing. So before each take, you just have to yell to the guys, yep, clap, done, and then start the very, very tedious process in post of syncing up all of the clap marks with the external audio.
Now, I have never done this myself. I always record to an external device, but I've never not recorded audio in the app. I've personally never run into that issue, but I'm assuming since it was so hot, by just limiting any other processing going on, that helped the app be more stable. But I would not suggest doing this yourself, by the way. This would be a lot of extra work in post-production for sure. Luckily, it was a short film and not a feature film. Wow, that would be extremely challenging to sync that stuff. But hey, that is part of indie filmmaking, having to do workarounds.
So for the audio, we just recorded with 2 radio mics and also a shotgun mic on a boom pole into a Zoom recorder, and then had to do the tricky part of syncing all that stuff up manually. And that took me a few days, I think. In between shoots and that kind of thing, I would sit down on the computer, start manually syncing up everything, because I could have got one of the other guys to do it. But given that I was behind pretty much every shot in the film, I knew all the sequencing of the shot better than anybody, and I knew the audio takes better than everyone. So it was just fell to me to go, all right, I'm just going to have to sit here and slug this out and get this done.
I'm just glad they actually had a sound person, because they had a very small crew.
So for the crew, there was actually only 5 of us. So it was a real skeleton crew. And we just had to make do with the guys that we had there and try and fill out the roles as best we could. But credit to James and Paul for pulling together everything that they did and being able to make this film work with such a small crew, especially in an international location.
And they didn't have a whole lot of time to shoot the film, especially since they were traveling.
So we actually shot for a week. So most days we would get a couple of scenes done here and there, and then go back and prepare for the next shoot, or go and hunt for locations, or try and find some new gear that we could go and pick up. So it was a real mix of go into the morning, shoot a scene, maybe nighttime, go and shoot a scene throughout the day, try and figure out logistics of what we needed for the next few days.
And beyond using the iPhone, they also shot some drone footage. And if you've seen the movie, that stuff looks great. And so I was curious if they were worried about matching that in post-production later.
So we did shoot some drone stuff too. As far as matching goes, I don't think it was too difficult. James has shot a lot of drone stuff with his Inspire 2, and the raw DNGs that you can get out of that allows you pretty great flexibility. So I think it was relatively simple to bring that on down to match with the iPhone footage.
Part of the reason I was drawn to this short, I think, is they have a lot of production value. Not only does the movie look bigger because they use the DOF adapter, and then of course the drone shots, but they also use the gimbal, which isn't easy using the B-script rig.
So not only did we shoot some drone stuff, but we also managed to shoot some gimbal stuff with the iPhone as well. So the way we did that was to mount it to the gimbal, we had to counterbalance it quite significantly, because the way the B-script works with the mount on the far left, once you've got a lens on there, the whole thing just tips to the side. So what we did was we had a custom weight made, and then we just put some rubber bands around it and attached it to the other side to just get that balance back a little bit better. And then, we were able to mount it to Moser Air 2. And I was then sitting on the back of a bike while I was pulled along and filming some of the tracking shots of the two guys on their bike riding down the street. So that stuff looks pretty amazing, actually. And I'm really proud of that stuff. And it was really cool that we could actually still mount all of that to a gimbal.
And I know I've said this a couple times, but be sure to watch my YouTube video based on this episode because you can see the gimbal rig they came up with and the DIY counterweight. It's pretty interesting looking. So with all these different tools and accessories they used, I wonder if Dave ended up liking the final look of the movie.
Yeah, I was really happy with how it turned out. I mean, I think the images that we were able to get out of the phone are pretty bloody amazing. When I watch it, it doesn't feel like it's an iPhone shot. I was a little bit hesitant before we started shooting this because I'd seen other content produced with smartphones and they always just had that certain look to it that just screamed that it was still a smartphone. I don't know if it's the sharpness or it's just the way it renders motion and that kind of thing, but it just never quite looked right to me and I wasn't convinced that we'd be able to produce something that didn't look like it was an iPhone. But when I started seeing the dailies back and realizing combining the phone with the app and with the lenses and having ND filters on the end so that we could keep the apertures open and really still make it feel cinematic, it really impressed me, to be honest. And when I watch the film now, it blows my mind. And there are some shots in there, especially that I just go, wow, I can't believe that's shot on an iPhone. So I hope that it gives a lot of people the ability to go, hey, iPhone's pretty fucking good. It can do some pretty incredible things when it's paired with the right material. I mean, even on its own, it can do some great things. But yeah, when you really take it seriously and you put the time into getting the image right, you can produce some pretty amazing looks.
Everything he just said there was really spot on. All the accessories really aren't required, but if you want it to look as good as this, or to look very cinematic, I highly suggest that. If nothing else, you've got to use ND filters. I preach that all the time. And the results with this film really speaks for itself. After shooting like this, though, I did wonder what his favorite and least favorite parts of the process were.
I think my favorite part of shooting with the smartphone was just discovering the challenges that come along with shooting with a smartphone. So I'd never done it before in that way, never with adapters and with lenses and that kind of thing, and trying to take your normal workflow of how you might shoot something, but just adapting it to this smartphone. So I think that for me was the most interesting part about it, and just learning all the quirks about it and how to get the best possible image out of it, because filmmaking is problem solving. And so doing something like, here's a brand new system for you to try and shoot on that you've never shot on before, that was probably the most interesting part for me. And probably the least favorite part of shooting with the phones was just adapting to those quirks that it would have, which at times would be quite frustrating. It wouldn't allow you necessarily to work quite as fluidly as you might work with a regular camera system.
And so in saying that, with hindsight being 2020, I wondered what he would do differently.
So if I was to do something differently, I would probably want to try and tighten up the rig of the Beast Grip kit a little better. So because you would still get that wobble, you'd get that lean, you'd get that bad center of balance, particularly if you've got a longer lens on. So I would probably try and get some rails for the bottom so they could also mount a follow focus, and maybe get some sort of counterweight for the lens as well so that you can just prop it up a bit so that you get less movement. And I think that would be a good start to getting a more solid, steady image. And also it might allow you to pull focus as well for shots, which would allow you to sell that idea that, no, this is not an iPhone. If you can rack focus in a shot on an iPhone, that's pretty bloody awesome. So that's what I'd probably like to do more of. And I would also probably just be a little bit more strict when it comes to slating shots. I would actually bring a slate, make sure that they're numbered and that they're marked correctly with the audio before each take, because that was probably where we lost a bit of time in post, just working all that stuff out and bringing all that footage and audio together at the end. So I would want to just be a bit more careful with that. You can still record onboard audio with the app when you do it, but we just discovered that you get a bit more of a fluid work with the app if you just have the audio off.
And so that led me to wondering if he would shoot like this again. Would he use a smartphone for another production?
Would I shoot on a smartphone again? I think, yeah, I would. I mean, having gone through this process and discovered everything to do with the phone and how to shoot with it and the pitfalls you might face and the challenges that can come along with it, but also the benefits that come along with it, I think I would definitely do it again. I mean, now that I know that you can shoot with a smartphone and have it look the way it can, I mean, that really impressed me. So there's no reason why I would discount it purely from a, aesthetics point of view, because you can get the look out of it if you want to. But it's just more about, is there a reason to use it for a production? Is there an aesthetic reason for it? Is there a logistics reason for it? It might be that you, like we were in Canggu in Bali, needing to get around to a lot of different places and trying to be a bit more subtle with your setups and that kind of thing. In that case, it's definitely a benefit. So yeah, if it made sense for the production to use one, I would definitely shoot on a smartphone again.
He obviously learned a lot during this shoot, and so I wondered what advice he would give to others wanting to shoot a film like this.
So advice that I might give for anyone looking to shoot on a smartphone would be just to learn it in and out. Whichever app you choose to go with, whichever gear you choose to pair it with, run your tests, go trial and error, go out into the real world, try and shoot some stuff, do a lot of testing to make sure that you learn the intricacies of how it operates. So the biggest thing for us was getting those exposures right. I mean, you can go out and you can just let it auto expose and that sort of thing, but that won't necessarily get you the best looking footage that you can get. It still might feel quite smartphone-like depending on how the settings are. I mean, if your shutter speed is cranked way up high, then you're always going to be in trouble with the image. So learning to balance those technical aspects are going to go a long way to producing a really great final image, and have fun with it. I mean, get different lenses, get different mounts, try and mount it to a gimbal, try and do anything you can with it. I mean, we had a lot of fun trying to learn the different ways that we could shoot with this thing, and having the footage come out the way it did. I mean, I'm really stoked that we took the time to try and do those different things. And I'm glad that we took the time to make sure those exposures and the ISOs and the shutter speeds were all correct for every shot. Because if they weren't, then it might not ended up as looking as good as it did. And if you're able to, I would definitely recommend trying to get the base grip or similar type of kit so that you can mount lenses onto it. Because as soon as you mount a lens onto the iPhone, you're already in a different ballgame. Because whilst the lenses within the phones, are definitely pretty good for what they are, it's never going to be able to match what you can do if you add an actual lens onto there. And when you do add a lens on as well, you're able to put ND filters on and you're really able to control the light a lot better. And then that allows you to then control the ISO and the shutter speed and get them to a better place so that you can get the best looking image out of it. If you shoot just with the smartphones as they are, you're always going to have that cranked up high shutter speed effect, which gives that motion just too sharp and it isn't quite filmic. So that's probably the main thing, is just try and learn it inside out, try and get some lenses and ND filters for it if you can, because all those things are going to go a long way to helping you get the most cinematic image you can out of your phone.
I think that's all really great advice, especially if you want to shoot a short film that looks like theirs. You can obviously shoot a film with none of the accessories and none of the adapters, etc., and those can look very good. I've done several like that myself. But if you really want to take it to the next level, I think what he's saying is absolutely valid and true. I'm not a convert, I wouldn't say, of the B-Script DOF adapter. I've talked about them quite a bit, the pluses and minuses, whether mobile filmmaking should really be more mobile. But it's getting to the point where these devices are so good that I really see a time in the near future where you could use these in place of a DSLR or in place of a mirrorless camera, depending on the job. Not quite there yet. Right now, it's more just for fun, in my opinion, or budgetary reasons if you can't afford a Blackmagic Pocket Cinema camera or what have you. But they're getting there, and they are really, really interesting. And the look of this film especially really, I think, could change some people's minds. So you might be asking yourself, where can I see this movie right now?
So at the moment, No Hard Feelings is on the festival circuit and has been since the end of last year. We're hoping to see it get into a few more festivals. And we know with COVID-19, it has cancelled or postponed a lot of festivals, but some are still doing online screenings of their selections and that kind of thing. And any ones that aren't doing that and have postponed until next year, allowing to accommodate for selections to be pushed to the following year or for them to automatically be reconsidered for the following year. So we're just hoping to see it get a bit more life and a bit more love at a few festivals from this year and leading into next year. And if you wanted to see anything more about what I'm working on, you can check out davidcleeve.com and you can find all of my social links and everything there as well.
So yeah, it is unfortunate that the movie's not available to see online right now, but I get it. It's totally cool. They're entering it in festivals, and that's really why you make short films. I assume this was done not only just for fun, but maybe a calling card, because it's really well done. The acting's great, the script is funny, the cinematography is great. It's a nice short film. And for the 10th time I've said it, if you want to see clips of it, I do have clips of it in my YouTube video, so be sure to check that out. Link for that is in the show notes of this episode, by the way. And also, I will post on Twitter when I hear about its availability, and on the YouTube video, I will pin a comment once I hear when it's available for people to see publicly.
Just want to say thank you, Blake, for having me and letting me talk about the process of making No Hard Feelings. I'm really proud of this film, and it's been great to see the reception that it's had so far, playing at a number of festivals. And for it to look the way it does, having been shot on a smartphone, is pretty amazing. And hopefully we can inspire some other creatives out there to get out and shoot some amazing content on their smartphones. Thanks a lot, mate. See ya.
And I think that's a great way to end this conversation. I am absolutely inspired by this short film, and you should be too. If you're into mobile filmmaking, or hell, filmmaking at all, this really should inspire you to get out there and make your movie. And I don't care, of course, if you use a smartphone. Use whatever camera you can, but just get out there and make something. I think that's the bigger point. There really are no excuses besides your own. And especially right now, while we're all safe at home during this pandemic, staying home during this pandemic. You can't go out and make a movie like this because you can't get together, but you could be working on your script. You could be devising a plan. So when the world does reopen, you get out there and make your movie. And I just want to say thank you to Dave Cleeve for taking the time to do all this. He put all the interview together on his side based on my questions and sent it to me, so I do appreciate that. And I also want to thank the producers of No Hard Feelings for providing me the footage and letting me showcase their project, even though it's not available publicly at this point, but it will be in the future. Well, I hope you enjoyed this behind-the-scenes look at the process of making the short film No Hard Feelings. One of the reasons I did this episode is I was just interested in myself. I just found it fascinating when I saw that, especially using the B-Script adapter. I had a lot of questions because I've been getting into using that. And so, of course, I thought that you guys that follow my YouTube channel and this podcast would be interested as well. I'll be doing more on my YouTube channel about the DOF adapter, and so look for that in the future. But in the meantime, again, if you're interested, don't forget about my academy, the courses on my website at ifilmmakers.tv. Stay safe out there, guys. Stay home, and of course, stay creative. This is Blake Calhoun and another episode of Almost Professional, the podcast about indie filmmaking, DIY filmmaking, mobile filmmaking, really all things filmmaking. Thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to talking to you guys in the next episode.